Good day. In my last couple of videos, I've spoken about how we are in the quiet before the storm in terms of where the Ukraine conflict is. And I maintain that view. I say that despite the fact that yesterday, Ukraine seems to have made a serious attempt to restart its otherwise stalled Kherson offensive. There were Ukrainian attacks all along the front lines in the northern region of Kherson. Most of these attacks seem to have been repulsed, but one involving an armoured column apparently did manage to drive forward along a main road along the banks of the Dnieper River until it was eventually stopped by the Russians at a place called Duran. Apparently around 150 armoured vehicles of various descriptions were involved, and according to some estimates, I gather about 3,000 men were involved in this particular convoy. There's much debate and discussion about what the purpose of this convoy was, whether it was intended to move all the way south towards Berislav and Novaya Kakhovka and capture the bridge across the dam, which has been, by the way, the major objective of the Ukrainian Kherson offensive ever since it was launched, or whether rather it was an attempt to create a strategic encirclement of the Russian grouping in North Kherson region, which has been repelling Ukrainian attacks up to now. I personally think the most likely explanation, given what we know about Ukrainian tactics and strategies and who is commanding the Ukrainian army, which most of the time seems to be President Zelensky, as opposed to his General Zaluzhny. I personally think that this armoured column was given a maximalist objective to move all the way south to Berislav and to capture Novaya Kakhovka. Anyway, it didn't get anywhere close to doing that. Ukrainians again suffered severe losses. They've been stopped for the moment, as I said, for the moment at least, at this place called Duran, and they are exposed as well to shelling by Russian artillery located on the other side of the Dnieper River and therefore effectively outside Ukraine's reach. Now, I don't want to minimize this event. I'm not sure where it's going to go. I will say that in this particular sector of the Kherson front, the one farthest east, closest to the Dnieper River, Russian forces have been relatively thin on the ground, not because there is a lack of Russian troops in Kherson region, we'll come to that in a moment, but because this is an area fairly remote, at least in Russian terms, from their main supply lines, so that they've not been able to base large numbers of troops here because it's been difficult or more difficult to keep those troops supplied. And to the extent that Ukraine has ever managed to capture any ground at all in the fighting in Kherson region, this is the area where Ukraine has made the most progress, where it's been able to take places like Vysokopolye and all those villages that we've heard about previously. And I suspect, though, that if Ukrainian forces were to start moving closer towards Novaya Kakhovka and Berislav, the dynamics would change in the sense that Russian supply lines would become shorter. It would become easier to keep the troops who are defending these places supplied, and the dynamics of the fighting might change. Having said that, whether this offensive is going to continue or not is problematic, and there are a number of reasons for this. Firstly, as now regularly happens when the Ukrainians launch these offensives, the talk is of very heavy losses. Apparently, out of that force of 150 armoured vehicles, something like 10 tanks were knocked out almost immediately. Another 20 armoured vehicles, armoured personnel carriers have also been knocked out. There's been severe damage done, in other words. But another factor which may make Ukrainian offensives in this part of Ukraine problematic is that the autumn rains apparently have now begun. Yesterday was a day of heavy rains in Kherson region, and already apparently this is starting to affect the country roads, many of them just dirt tracks, in this part of the Ukrainian steppe. And if these rains continue, then it's likely that we're going to have very soft ground, which will make any encirclement operations by Ukraine extremely difficult. In the meantime, this Ukrainian armoured column is apparently stuck on the asphalt road near this place called Duran, where, as I said, it's been shelled heavily by Russian artillery. I would say that the rains actually did help the Ukrainians here in one respect, in that as the rains closed in, the Russian Air Force was unable to sustain its bombing and airstrikes, which in this part of the conflict area, this area of the war, have up to now been devastating to Ukraine. So Ukraine did gain something from the coming of the rains, but I wonder whether, as I said, it's now going to be difficult for it to sustain further offensive operations, always assuming, of course, that the weather continues and we don't see a dry spell over the next few days. Well, we'll see. Anyway, the rains, by the way, also had a similar effect further east, where Ukrainian forces based in the now recaptured place of Liman made a move yesterday against the village of Krenaya, which is now one of the areas which the Russians are defending along their new front line. There's reports that engineering equipment has been brought up by the Russians to this village, and that they're now busy building trenches and doing all the other things necessary to fortify this village from further Ukrainian attacks. Anyway, regardless, the Ukrainians did try, apparently, to launch some kind of attack against this village, but they found it difficult to sustain, again, because of the rains. The rains made it difficult for Ukrainian troops to move, and the artillery, Ukrainian artillery, found it difficult also to home in on targets because of the poor visibility. So it's likely, not certain, as I said, there's always a possibility of a dry spell, but the weather is now changing. The envelope, the time frame for Ukrainian offensives may be coming to an end. And besides, as I've repeatedly pointed out, Ukraine loses large numbers of troops, has lost large numbers of troops and equipment over the course of these offensives. Some have suggested that the numbers now amount to something like 20,000 men killed a month over the course of September. Now, I can't obviously confirm that, but that would be a horrendous death toll if it was true. And can I repeat again a point I have repeatedly made and want to make once more, which is that this idea that Ukraine has an unlimited manpower pool is a myth, and it certainly doesn't have an unlimited equipment pool. No army of the size of Ukraine's, 400,000 men, apparently, can sustain losses on this scale indefinitely. It doesn't work like that. Anybody who's worked in any organization knows what the effect would be of an organization like an army suffering attrition at this kind of level. By contrast, by the way, Russian losses over the course of these offensives seem to have been very minor. Now, I just want to revisit an old topic. I still see some people insisting that the Third Army of the militia of the Donetsk People's Republic, this famous Third Army we were hearing so much about, was obliterated over the course of Ukraine's Kharkiv counteroffensive. I've repeatedly said that the Third Army was absolutely not stationed in Kharkiv and that this is a myth. And in fact, I'm going to repeat that again. To my knowledge, it was deployed via Rostov region, principally to Zaporozhye and the areas of the southern Donbass around Ugleda. We haven't heard much about this Third Army because, like pretty much everything else, I think it's being held back for the big Russian offensives that are going to start to materialize eventually, but about which I will say more in a moment. But anyway, if a force of, let's say, 10,000 men had been obliterated in battles in Kharkiv region, in ETHEREUM and Balaklia, we would surely have pictures of large numbers of dead Russian soldiers, large hauls of prisoners, large hauls of equipment, destroyed Russian equipment. We've seen nothing like that. There's been a few prisoners, but I suspect you could probably count them on your fingers. There's been some obviously dead, but again, doesn't seem like it was so many. And I've seen some guesstimates of the number of armored vehicles, Russian armored vehicles, captured by the Ukrainians in Kharkiv region, and I think less than a score would be about the correct number. And moreover, it seems that of that score, perhaps a dozen were broken down vehicles in a repair facility, which were left where they were. They couldn't really be moved in time. So we simply haven't seen the evidence of big Russian casualties in Kharkiv region. And the same has been true of Liman. Once Liman was captured, again, if there'd been thousands of Russians encircled in Liman and thousands of Russians killed, we would be seeing pictures of large numbers of pictures of dead Russian soldiers, large numbers of pictures of prisoners and of equipment. And we haven't really seen anything like that at all. And in fact, Russian claims are that the defenders of Liman, who, as I've said previously, were irregular soldiers from the Lugansk militia, despite this town being in Donetsk city, but in Donetsk region, Lugansk militia backed by a Cossack unit, irregular Cossack unit of volunteers from Russia, numbering about 500 men. Anyway, most reports suggest that they have suffered light casualties and have now relocated and are able and willing to fight again in this village of Kherson. And the same, I suspect, is true of these latest offensives in Kherson region. The Russians don't fight, they don't do what the Ukrainians have been doing. They don't stand and fight. They don't try to hold on to undefendable positions. They don't try to reinforce those positions to make them defendable. They have consistently, over the last few weeks, since the Ukrainians began their offensive, prioritized preserving the lives of their soldiers. Now, if you followed my programs, you will know that that is exactly what I think an army should do. I don't personally believe in heroic last stands. Maybe from time to time, in particular situations, they are appropriate, but generally speaking, it seems to me that heroic last stands simply throw away lives in the most callous and cruel way to no useful purpose. Keeping troops fighting in Mariupol, refusing to let them surrender when no other option existed, that, to my mind, was completely inappropriate command behavior. Trying to cling on to places like Severodonetsk and Lysychansk as the Russians were closing in, that also was inappropriate behavior. Losing 1,000 men a day to hold on to those towns, even as the Russian advance accelerated, and it was inevitable that these cities would fall. Again, that made absolutely no sense to me. And for the record, and let me repeat again, I do not buy the story that Ukraine was buying time by doing that in order to build up its reserves, in order to launch these offensives, which we have seen this September. I think all those men could have been withdrawn from Mariupol and Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, and could have been placed in far more defendable positions, and Ukraine would still have found the time and the space to build up its reserves for these offensives we've seen in September. So let me repeat again, I am not somebody who supports heroic last stands. I don't think that makes any kind of sense. Every instinct I possess rebels against this idea. Obviously, I'm not a military person. I accept that there may be times, very few times, when such things are necessary, but certainly in the battle for Liman, in the battles of Kharkov, and perhaps this latest battle, which we've seen in Kherson, that certainly does not apply, and the Russians were right to pull back and preserve the lives of their troops by doing so. Now, that's as far as we can get on the questions of the battlefields, of what's going on in the battlefields. And I come back to what I was saying about the quiet before the storm. Now, it seems, as I said, that the reservists have now all been called up in Russia, and we're seeing lots of pictures of them go through their training in various places up and down this enormous country. We also see lots and lots of films now of vast convoys of Russian armored vehicles pouring into Crimea and perhaps Kherson region in preparation for something. Now, I'm not a person who's able to study film or photos. I have no background in that kind of thing. My eyesight sometimes makes it difficult for me to do that. But what I will say is this: I have no reason to doubt these pictures. I mean, it did occur to me that perhaps we're looking at the same pictures time and again, and there might be some element of bluff here. But on balance, I don't think so. And it does seem that the amount of military material that is being built up by the Russians in Crimea and in the southern regions of what was once Ukraine, or what is still actually technically Ukraine, I'll come to that in a moment, is simply enormous. And I'm assuming that all this material, all this machinery that's being deployed there is intended to be used by these reservists when they're, or at least by these new formations, when they're deployed to the battlefields. And there's talk of similar build-up of large armoured forces in Kharkiv region. I can't help but think that over the next few weeks, once the ground begins to harden again, we're going to start to see all of these forces being activated, and they are being deployed on a scale which so far Ukraine simply can't match. So that's the storm that's coming. I'm not going to provide a timeline. I have no idea what Russian plans are. I don't know what the Russians propose to do. I've seen some suggestions that the Russians are broadly satisfied with the progress of events in Donbass itself, that they're happy with the advances that the Wagner group is making in Bakhmut city, that they're not really planning big armoured offensives in Donbass, which would be a heavily built up area, perhaps not ideal for heavily armoured offensives. So maybe if we're talking about armoured offensives, maybe they're going to come up in other places. Now, let's come back now to the political calendar. It seems to me that we have today a meeting of the Duma where the treaties of accession of the four regions will be overwhelmingly ratified. By the time this video goes up, we'll no doubt have heard about that. And it's likely that the Federation Council will meet tomorrow, and it too will complete the ratification of these treaties. And then I suppose Putin will sign off on the laws incorporating these regions. And at that point, obviously, these territories will become formally a part of Russia. Always, I stress again, in Russian eyes. And then, of course, the special military operation will end because these will be Russian territories, and all the indications are that we'll be getting some kind of a Russian ultimatum to Ukraine at that point. And if that ultimatum is not heeded, which it is impossible for Ukraine to heed it, then presumably the Russians will upgrade or their operation, and they will announce that it will be something else. And Denis Pushilin, the head of the Crimean government, said that it will be upgraded to a counter-terrorism operation. So that will presumably set the scene for these armoured offensives at some stage, presumably when the ground starts to harden. Well, we shall see. There has to be, or so it seems to me also, a completion of the retraining of these reservists, 300,000 of them. I suspect a lot of them are going to be fed into the existing units who are located in the battle zone to bring them back up to strength. And it does look as if new formations also are going to be formed, and no doubt existing formations are going to be redeployed from Russia. So that's the storm which at some point is coming. We'll see when it comes, what it amounts to, what the plan is. I'm not going to speculate beyond what I've said up to this point. I am going to say something further, however, which is that I'm getting more and more news, information trickling in about what happened to the Russian military in Ukraine in August. Now, I've spoken in the past about the fact that it seems that the professional soldiers who were part of the Russian military and whose terms were about to expire at the time when the special operation was launched had their terms extended by 6 months. And it seems that there was some hope on the part of the Russian military authorities in August, when those 6 months ended, that these professional soldiers would accept further 6-month extensions. Now, I am not someone who has any knowledge of, well, at least I didn't have any knowledge until the start of this war, of battlefield tactics, war plans, strategies, military operations, or any of those sort of things. I do know something about human psychology, and I should say that many, many years ago, I did work in a legal advice clinic which gave advice to British soldiers. If anybody had asked me, I would have said straightforwardly that there was no possibility that these men would agree to renew their contracts for a further 6 months when they had ended. Anybody who thinks that, anybody who expects people who've been in battle zones to sign up repeatedly to continue their service in that kind of way, I mean, just has no understanding of human psychology. At the time when the special military operation was launched back in February, many of these people would already have been looking forward to joining civilian life. They'd have made plans, they'd have developed relationships, they'd have certainly been looking or thinking about life beyond the army. Probably because they're professionals, they would have accepted the fact that they'd been asked to serve for a further 6 months, but expecting them to voluntarily agree to put off their plans, whatever they were, for a further 6 months beyond that is naive. I can only assume that because the Russian military has only been working with professional soldiers for a relatively short space of time, until fairly recently, the Russian military operated according to the Soviet system, and all its infantry were basically conscripts, long-term conscripts. I can only assume that the Russian military authorities didn't fully grasp that. So, unsurprisingly, what happened was that in August, all of these people quit, as they would have been expected to do. Now, I don't know how many of these people there were, but I'm starting to hear some extraordinary numbers, putting the number up to 50,000. Now, if that's anything like true, then it would go far to explain why there's been this reduction in Russian forces in Ukraine over the course of August, and why, when the Ukrainians began these offensives in September, the Russians found themselves short of combat infantry. I would say something further, which is that it does seem that some Russian commanders on the ground did understand what was coming and were trying to advise the Defense Ministry of this. And one of them apparently was none other than General Lapin, the general who has recently been criticized, perhaps unfairly, by Ramzan Kadyrov, and who is said to have been responsible for who Kadyrov perhaps unjustly claimed was responsible for the loss of Krasny Liman. Anyway, apparently Lapin told the Russian military authorities back in June that in August the military was going to lose a large proportion of its men, and that what needed to happen was a mobilization to make sure that they stayed in their regiments, and that in fact that those regiments were reinforced. Well, at that time, that advice went unheeded, and one wonders what the debate in the Kremlin, if there was one at that time what the reasons were, whether there was concern that mobilization would be unpopular and that might lead to protests, whether the civilian ministries of the Russian government were concerned that it might have an effect on the Russian economy, or whether the defense ministry was sure, contrary to the advice of people like Lapin, that most of these soldiers would stay with their regiments and would happily renew their contracts. Well, I don't know what the facts are, and one day I'm sure we will find out, but the fact is that the mobilization has now happened, and from what I can see, it seems to have gone reasonably well. There were hitches and problems at the start, but overall the problems seem to have been sorted. Most of the men have been called up, and as one fact which reflects this is that apparently the number of people leaving Russia through places like Kazakhstan and Georgia has now subsided to the usual number of people going backwards and forwards. So that's where we are, or so it seems to me. A major Russian build-up coming, 300,000 men joining the Russian military over the next few weeks and months. A Ukrainian offensive which may have reached its limit. Ukraine having suffered heavy losses in men and material over the course of it, and so far having failed to achieve anything of strategic significance, and Russian plans about which I can only speculate, because, as I've said many times, the Kremlin and the Russian General Staff don't share their views with me. Now, of course, a lot is also going on elsewhere. There was a meeting in Istanbul, of all places, between a Ukrainian official, the top Ukrainian official, President Zelensky's national security advisor, and Jake Sullivan. Jake Sullivan was in Istanbul in order to try to get Erdogan to agree, finally, to the admission of Finland and Sweden into NATO. At the last NATO summit, Erdogan appeared to agree, but then he's come round again and said that at the moment he's not happy with Finnish and Swedish compliance with their commitments to break with the Kurds, and therefore, for the moment, it's looking unlikely that the Turkish parliament will ratify that inclusion of Sweden and Finland into NATO. So Jake Sullivan went to Istanbul to talk all that over with the senior Turkish officials, and whilst there he met with this Ukrainian official who apparently came again with a long wish list for new weapons, which I suspect the US can only now accommodate up to a certain degree. Meanwhile, whilst on the subject of Turkey, it seems that Turkey, which had been pressing forward with use of the Mir card, but which as a consequence faced threats from the United States of sanctions against its banks, is now rethinking the idea. The original Turkish banks have recalled their decision to work with the Mir card, and the Turks are now said by the Russian media to be in detailed talks with the Russians about setting up a special bank, a Russian-Turkish bank, to service the Mir card, and apparently it's going to rely, to a certain extent at least, on blockchain technology, which is all very interesting, at least to me, partly because I've been wondering how extensive and effective blockchain technology really is. But anyway, that's apparently what's happening there. Meanwhile, in Germany, the German authorities are now also becoming concerned that with the cold weather, Germans are not heeding the advice they were given to use less fuel. In fact, energy use in Germany is considerably higher this September, was considerably higher last September than it was September last year, when the weather was actually extremely warm. And again, I have to say, I do wonder about human psychology, because apparently it seems that some people in the German government really did believe that Germans would heed all that advice and would turn down their radiators and would do all those sort of things and would give up use of heating as the weather turned cold. Again, anybody with any knowledge of human psychology will tell you that people will listen to that advice, will say they agree with it, and then when the weather turns cold, they will do what they need to do to stay warm, which is turn the radiators on. So if the German government really did believe that it would be able to reduce energy use in this kind of way, well, then it was deluding itself. Just as the Russians perhaps deluded themselves about the intentions of their reservists. One way or the other, it's looking now as if the energy crisis in Europe is going to be particularly vicious. And apparently, despite the fact that the oil price cap idea has been rubber stamped by the G7 states and by the European Commission, it's now coming in for considerable opposition from some EU states who are worried that a price cap on Russian oil is simply going to cause a disappearance of supply. Last but not least, on this topic of the subject of oil, the Saudi-Russian oil alliance appears to be functioning, and OPEC Plus is now looking at a production cut of up to 1 million barrels a day. Now, this is, I have to say, an extraordinary step to take on the eve of winter. And there's all kinds of explanations as to why this is done to supposedly balance the oil market. I find that all very difficult to understand, given the sanctions war excuse me, that's going on. But that, it seems, is the decision that OPEC Plus is taking. Well, I don't know, as I said in my previous program, how the West will resolve its energy problems, or at least the Europeans will resolve these energy problems this winter. The British government has already abandoned one of its tax cut plans, the plan to cut the higher rate of tax from 45% to 40% for higher earners. I think it's an insignificant change, actually, and of course it doesn't remotely address the underlying problems. As I've said previously, the problem is not tax cuts. The tax cuts is the vast extra spending that all the European governments, including the British government, have committed themselves to. So I don't know what they're going to do. It doesn't seem to me as if they have a plan. They appear to be hoping that the reduction in gas supplies from Russia to Europe is going to push the Russian budget into deficit. Might do, but the deficit that I hear talked about is perhaps 2% of GDP, and anybody who thinks that the Russians can't fund a deficit of 2% of GDP by borrowing on the Russian commercial market is, again, delusional. We'll see where all this goes. That's the situation at the moment. As I said, the calm before the storm, but the storm clouds are gathering. Thank you for joining me again today for this program. More from me soon. Remember, you can find us on other platforms: Locals, Rumble, ODYSEE, BitChute, and of course Telegram. And remember that on Locals, I do live streams every Wednesday at 1900 hours London time and 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time. And you can also if you want to support our work, do so via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. And you can go to our shop and buy the great things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, and all the rest. And remember, if you've liked this video, to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon, and have a very good day until then.